The Speaking of Cults podcast is presented solely for general informational, educational, and entertainment purposes. The use of information on this podcast or materials linked from it is at the user's own risk. The views, information, or opinions expressed by the host and guests are solely those of the individuals involved and do not constitute medical or other professional advice. Hello and welcome to the Speaking of Cults podcast. This is Chris Shelton, your host. Thank you very much for joining me today. And we're going to get right into it. This is an episode I've been looking forward to doing for a little while now. This is author Annie Dawid, and she is the author of many books. And today we're going to be talking about her sixth book, which is called Paradise Undone, a novel of Jonestown. And this was something that actually has its own little adventure story in the writing and publishing of the book, which we'll talk about. But Annie is a teacher of creative writing for the master's program in writing at the University of Denver University College. Annie, welcome to my show.
Thanks. I'm really thrilled to be on your show.
Awesome. Well, I'm thrilled to have you. And I'm first off, let's go ahead and begin with sort of the origin story of this book, because this is do I understand it right? This is not a nonfiction description of Jonestown and the history of it. This is a novel or a novelized version of the events. Is that right? Yeah,
it's historical fiction. So you can sort of check all the facts and the dates that I use because I did years of research. But of course, as a fiction writer, I made things up like conversations between characters, and I have 4 protagonists and 2 are based on real people and 2 are composites that are based on research.
Excellent. Excellent. And yeah, you did quite a bit of research on this, a kind of old school style too. Do you want to tell the story of how you actually wrote this book? Because I found it interesting. I was reading in the Colorado Sun about this, and you were kind of off the grid and you were researching and listening to Jim Jones on tape. And how did this come across your plate to start with, and how did you how was the process?
Okay. I had written a short story about a Jewish family from New York whose 2 daughters out of 3 had joined a cult in New Mexico in the 1980s. And so this is after the Jonestown massacre. And I was reading this short story at a writer's conference in 2003, and I read the part where the parents go to a deprogrammer to try and get their daughters out of the cult. And that did happen in real life. This is based on a friend's family, not my own family. Mm-hmm. And the deprogrammer says to them, well, you should know before you hire me that my daughter died in Jonestown. And I made that up. But it was just like a caveat emptor moment to the parents that he couldn't get his own daughter out of a cult. And, he can't get eventually he doesn't get their daughters out either. Mm. But anyway, so Jonestown was one word in this super long story that I read in front of 600 people. And afterwards, a member of the audience comes up to me who's a friend of mine, and he was crying. And he said, I have friends who lost family in Jonestown. And so that had affected him so much out of this other story. And it was a powerful moment for me as a writer that my story had moved someone so much. And so a couple of months later, I was getting ready for my second sabbatical, which I was going to spend in Colorado. And I had planned to write a novel that was called Hippie Ruins. And it was about these 2 hippie communes in the Huerfano Valley in southern Colorado. And I had friends in those communes, and I visited them. And so that was my plan. So I'm at Powell's bookstore, which is the big used bookstore. and I'm in the C aisle and I'm looking at communes, and then I slide down a little and I get to cults. And there are all these books about Jonestown there. And then I'm remembering that moment back in the North Dakota Writers Conference, and I'm thinking, I have to write about Jonestown. The hippie ruins book can wait. There's nothing urgent about it. And so it's still waiting 20 years later. But I felt like the moment deserved the urgency of people following, good people who follow cult leaders to their detriment. And then, as in the case of Jonestown, to their death. And that felt like an urgent story to tell. So that's how I switched to writing a book about Jonestown.
Awesome. Got it on that. The whole origin story there. And I have it right that this began in 2004 and you actually had it completed for the 30th anniversary of the incident in November 2008, and then had a hard time getting it published.
Well, right. So what happened was, that was my plan. I researched for a year. Then I took a leave of absence after my sabbatical was over, and then I wrote for a year, and then I still had to revise, and so I quit my job. And I was in this little cabin off the grid in southern Colorado with my 5-year-old son, and I decided I'm going to go. This book is so important to me. So I kept going there. So being off the grid meant that every winter the pipes froze, and we had lots of animal visitors of all kinds in the house and outside the house. And I loved it out there. It was very isolated. So yeah, part of my research was listening to the tapes. There's this enormous audio library, which is available through the Jonestown Institute, which is the major research for anything Jonestown. And it was centered at San Diego State University, but now everything is online pretty much. And so I got all these tapes, and I would put on my Walkman. I mean, these were cassettes. I put on my Walkman, I go hike my land with my dogs and listen to not just Jim Jones, but all the other people and news programs about Jonestown, etc. And I had it ready. I had a New York agent, because I knew 2008, as the 30-year anniversary, was going to be a big one. And he solicited about 40 big presses, and 2 of them were interested. And one of them said, well, we really like this book, but we're publishing a nonfiction book about Jonestown in 2008, and we don't want to have 2 Jonestown books on our list. So sorry. And then the other one, this guy really liked it, and he had just moved from a big press to a smaller press. So he was like a brand new boss at this new press. And he showed the book to the sales staff, and quote unquote, they hated it. And he felt like, as a new boss, he could not kind of pull his rank on the sales staff. So he said, sorry. So then my agent said, sorry, I got to give it back to you. And I spent the next 15 years sending it out myself to contests and presses that took unagented work. And then I wrote an epigraph for the 40th anniversary in 2018. And during those 15 years, the book was a finalist 17 times. So that told me it gets up to the top 10. And then the judge goes through those 10 books, and it's kind of a matter of taste. All other things being equal, they're all well written.
Yep.
And so I just never made it to the publication stage. And then in 22, I came into contact with this British publisher, she was starting a new press, so a brand new publisher, and I told her about my book, and she said, "Well, I'd like to read it." And then a month later, she said, "I want to publish your book."
Excellent.
And that's how it happened.
Nice. Do you think this is just kind of purely out of left field I'm sure, but I'm very enmeshed in, or in deep into the cult world. And it seems to me, and I've spoken about this, that it's become a legit, fully acknowledged subgenre of the true crime genre at this point, in terms of where stories and documentaries and literature about it, where it fits. It kind of fits there. Do you think that subgenre has grown in popularity recently, and that might be one reason why there's more interest in it now?
Well, I agree with your assessment, and I think true crime and stories about cults have suddenly to me, because I wasn't paying attention all these years, like, to the cult world, but now I'm immersed in it, and it seems like it's so huge. Plus, we are in this time of cults right now that makes, my story is a true crime story of the death of 918 people in one day. And then it's also a cult story, and people who follow somebody to their detriment, including their lives, is going on around us every single day.
That's right. That's right.
So I think that is part of what made it relevant right now. But I also think that the Jonestown story is a terrible piece of American history. It doesn't reflect well on the USA. And I kind of think that's why I couldn't get it published in the USA, despite rising there. And then this British publisher, it doesn't reflect on her country.
Right. Right.
And I said to her, "Oh, I always thought it was such an American story. That's why I didn't try and publish it in other countries." And she said, "No, it's not an American story. It's an international story. It's a human interest story." So she said, "I don't just see it as an American story." And I think she's right there.
I would agree.
She also didn't have to feel any stain on her own people for sort of allowing it to happen,
Sure. That's an interesting take, and one I would like to discuss more with you today. I wanted to ask or say a couple things, and then kind of get into the facts of the story. For me, from my position as somebody who grew up in a cult, who got out of a cult, who has been talking about cults for a long time now, I'm pretty, like I said, pretty enmeshed in that world. And I know that I'm glad you said what you said about the rise of cult as a genre, that I'm right about that, because I've never had a chance to ask a writer about that. I've always kind of put that out there from my own observations. But Jonestown also represents, in this world of cults, in the world of cult awareness and activism, Jonestown represents the seminal moment, as far as I'm concerned, of when the world actually became aware of the fact that cults are a thing and that they're dangerous. I think that there were people who knew about cults before because they were personally touched by it, a family member, a friend. I mean, 60s and 70s were definitely a time of flourishing cults, but it was localized. It wasn't like a national story. Nobody was talking international. That's right. Nobody was talking about it that way. It wasn't recognized as a problem of coercion and abuse and even death. That this was just not how these things were talked about. Does that fit with, does my assertion there fit with your research of that time period and what Jonestown represented?
Yeah, I mean, I think on the show where John Attack and Joe Simhart talked about my book,
Yep.
one of them said something like, Jonestown is, the top death cult, and then Manson is the next sort of most talked about cult
Yep.
because of Charles Manson himself. But what happened with Jonestown, so even though it was an American cult and everybody who died was American, it happened in Guyana in South America, where Jones had taken his congregation because he was ultra paranoid, but he was also being investigated. I mean, he didn't make up that he was being looked into, and
Yeah.
rightfully. So the death of nearly 1,000 people in one day is going to make international headlines.
Yeah.
And so the whole world heard about it through mass media, which at that time was like TV and newspapers and magazines. And the covers there were all these bodies, including 300 kids out of those 900 plus
Yeah.
bodies.
That's right.
And it was so appalling. And so the shock value of it was really appallingly played up by national media. And what happened then was this mega interest in Jones the monomaniac, Jones the maniac, and all of his followers at the time in 1978 were depicted as these brainless zombies.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how the whole world kind of came to think of Jonestown was the charismatic leader, the brainless followers drinking the Kool-Aid, which was poison, but it wasn't actually Kool-Aid. It was called Flavor Aid.
That's right.
And like for decades, it was only all about Jim Jones. Like, let's just talk about Jim Jones.
Sure.
He's so fascinating because he's a monster. And let's not even mention those 917 other people. And 80% of those people were African American. And that kind of got left out and not talked about, the whole racial element of the People's Temple in Jonestown. So when I started doing my research in 2004, that became really clear to me. And just that everything was about Jim Jones. And I was like, I'm not going to write about Jim Jones. Jim Jones has everything written about him and all the movies and the documentaries, etc. So I knew I wanted to write about the other people who were involved and who were key to making it function, which included his wife, Marceline Baldwin Jones. And at the time, there was like nothing written about her. And she was there when she met him in 1949 in a hospital where he was an orderly, and they built this church. So for 29 years, they were together, and she died there on the last day of poison.
Right. Yeah, that's a very good, well-rounded approach to it, because it's understandable with our media in general, but certainly United States media. It's not okay. I'm just saying it's understandable that they simplify things. They're always looking for the stereotype, for the meme, for the trope that they can feed people, because people want simple explanations for things.
Exactly.
And Jonestown is not a simple issue. It was a complicated, nuanced, changing situation. And Jones was a complex guy, and there's a lot, and I'm sure you know more than I do, about how complex that man was. It's very hard to communicate in a headline. Yes, he was a, anti-racist activist who formed a church and congregation and really helped support the black community before he got involved in drugs, went crazy, became investigated, and took his flock down to Guyana. And even that is the silliest of synopsis of all the things that happened over, decades of time.
Right. But, people go for the simple answer. And so in my book, I wanted to just illuminate some of the other human beings that were part of this. And the cover of the book, so you can see there's this Jones-like figure with his cross, and then he's got this faceless herd of people behind him, and they're headed to Guyana. And this is a line drawing by an African American artist named Joe Sam, who lived in the Bay Area at the time and did a huge series of drawings about Jonestown. And in the Bay Area, you know, everybody knew people who died. It was a
Right.
very Bay Area tragedy.
Right.
And I chose to use that cover because that's how the world saw it. You know, there's Jim Jones and then there's the faceless people. And my hope for the book was that by the time you finish reading it, you would be able to distinguish lots of people in that crowd that you couldn't distinguish when you started it because they were just this mass of human beings who were dehumanized by the mass media, in fact.
Yeah, big time. They are, and that is an all too common occurrence with these kinds of events.
Yeah.
And these
cults in general.
That's right. That's right. Well,
right?
Well, the number one comment. The most. It's not the number one comment. The comment that occurs most often, all the way up to today, on my channel when I talk about and educate about cults is, you'd have to be a moron, stupid person, idiot, fill in the blank, to join a cult. You'd have to be a bloody idiot, right? And much stronger language. And there's this judgment factor that happens because people are informed of the end before the beginning. They know what happens, and they see the negative consequences of the decisions and choices that people made, and they go, well, for somebody to make decisions that end up drinking poison Flavorade, you'd have to be a moron. And it's such a lack of understanding of the process and of how we are built and made up and how we do what we do.
Right.
I'm glad you agree. And it seems that your approach to this is actually quite original because it's not as common for people to fictionalize the narrative and then spend as much time humanizing the victims. And the fact is that it is a codependent relationship. The leader can stand on a corner and yell into the sky all day long, but until he gets followers who actively follow, there's really not much of a cult. So so this approach is actually quite insightful and could really humanize these people. What was the biggest in the broad strokes of this, because we do of course know the spoiler outcome of the book and we know where it goes. What were the surprises? I'm going to say the biggest surprise, but I'm sure there were many. What stands out to you as things that you went into this thinking, okay, maybe it's going to be this and this and this, and it turned out to not be this and this and this. It turned out to be something very different.
Right. Well, so besides Marceline Jones, my other protagonists are the Guyanese ambassador to the United States, and that's based on a real person, but I did not use his real name. And in real life, on the 3rd anniversary of the Jonestown massacre, which was 1981, he killed his wife and child and then himself. And she had been a worker for Jones and had gotten together with him, and they had a child. And to him, and I understood from my reading that the Jonestown incident in the history of Guyana, which used to be British Guyana and was only really newly independent, like Jones kind of destroyed the history of Guyana for a while because it happened, and nobody knew Guyana anyway. And then suddenly, oh, Guyana, that's where all those crazy people killed themselves, right? And that was, for 20 years, that's all Guyana meant. And it wasn't this rising democracy or anything. And so I had read there were very few novels written about Jonestown when I started in 2004, but there was one written by a British Guyanese writer. And I read that book, and, seeing it from the eyes of Guyana, it was like another version of colonists, So this time it was the Americans. They came over, they took over the narrative, and they didn't care about what happened to the Guyanese. It was only about them and their story. And then the world media reports it like that too. So
Sure.
I knew I wanted a Guyanese voice. And he's an educated, intellectual, cynical kind of a man. And he just feels that Jones ruined his beautiful native country, and he's angry. And so I guess in terms of your question, so I mean, he's a murderer himself in real life and a suicide after the fact at Jonestown 3 years later. But I guess I would say what surprised me was I had great sympathy for him, and I didn't know I would build up that sympathy. And I know that from reader feedback, like, people hate him. I mean, he does this hateful thing, and he's awful, but what you can do in fiction that you can't do in nonfiction is you give someone an inner voice, and however troubled or wrong it is, you can, I hope, see the humanity inside the character that you yourself have.
Yep.
And so I came to really relate to his feeling like these Americans come over and they colonize and they ruin, even though they think they're these Marxist, socialist, groovy, and it's mixed race. The whole group is mixed, but, it's really just run by white people. And they end up kind of ruining in the same way the Brits ruined, and the French and the Spanish and the Portuguese, how all the colonizers took over all these native countries. That's really what was the result of Jonestown for Guyana. Yeah. Although I should say, right now, 2024, Guyana is back in the headlines because they found this massive oil field off the coast. And so now they're going through this fast money, kind of like Nigeria in Africa, where I think suddenly everybody wants their oil, and then certain people are going to get super rich. Right. And of course, everybody else is going to get left out. So anyway, I was reading this article in the New York Times about this, and then I said, oh my God, this is an article about Guyana that doesn't mention Jim Jones. This is like the first article. And then I communicated with Becky Moore, who's the head of the Jonestown Institute, has become a friend to me. And she said, yeah, you're right. That's amazing.
Yeah.
It's Jonestown in 2024. Yeah. 46 years later.
It's hardly surprising. People's memories of things like this are long. And from a different perspective, of course, because you're bringing an original, sort of perspective to this in terms of the colonization and that viewpoint of this. And that's not like I don't get where you're coming from. There are just so many ways of looking at this. It is an event that will never be forgotten. Let's put it that way. And as with events like that, there are lots and lots and lots of ways of breaking it down or in analyzing it or looking at its causes and its effects. Because the reason why things happen, and I only get to say this every now and again, so I'll jump in with this. The reason something happens is because of everything. There's no one reason why things happen. They happen because all the things that were happening around it happened to make it happen. But in the case of a Jonestown, we can look at a Jim Jones, we can look at his followers, we can look at his enablers, we can look at people who could have stopped it earlier, who turned a blind eye. We can look at the fact of, the senator who went down there and was killed for the effort. People tried to figure out what was going on, but it was a little too late. And the religious angle of this, there's a beginning in Jones's life of, even as a child, I understand he was someone who was enamored with the idea of being a preacher. This was his playtime as a kid, as he would actually play at being a preacher to his flock or his congregation, and he spent quite a bit of time learning that skill set, teaching himself how to be a charismatic leader. Not all of these cult leaders do that. Right. It's kind of interesting, his effort at that. But what I'm curious about from your research is his wife. Mm-hmm. Because she's a main character of the book. You chose her as one of the protagonists. Right. What was it that made you think, after looking into all of this, she's one of the characters to focus on? And what were her actions along the way? You said they met as when he was a hospital orderly. What's that story?
Right. Well, so you mentioned enablers, and she's definitely one of them, but not the only one by far. Mm-hmm. So she is the daughter of a minister, and she marries a minister, and this is the late 40s, okay? This is pre-women's movement, and generally for someone like her from middle-class Indiana, you're not going to get divorced. When you marry somebody, it's for better or worse. And so I saw her as someone who felt constrained by that. She was not a rebel in that way. She wasn't going to leave him after the first, second, or 15th mistress, That was not.
Was he a philanderer?
Oh, yes. He was par excellence, like they all
Like
are.
they all are, yeah. It is a common trait of cult leaders, for sure. Anyway, sorry.
Right.
Please carry on.
Yeah, that's okay. And he also had children with other women, too.
Of course.
So it wasn't just the sex, it was procreating. But anyway, so I tried to look at it to say, well, what did she get out of it? And so their church, and they had more than one church under more than one name in Indiana, and it grew. So they were the first church in Indiana to integrate. It was important to them to integrate, and they faced major animosity for wanting to have Black and white people together at church on Sunday. But it was also very popular, and their church kept growing. So then they had to get a new church because they needed a bigger building, and et cetera.
Interesting. So this was Jones leading this movement.
Right. So with her, like a lot of ministers, it's always all about the minister, but the wife is doing everything behind the scenes. So they were kind of a team, I would say, in the beginning. And he was the charismatic guy preaching, but she did everything. She was massively organized and massively energetic and made things happen. And they wanted to have a social justice element of their church. And that was really important to her. And so they had a soup kitchen, and they did services for the elderly, and that was something that was important to her whole life. She ran in California some homes for the elderly, and then she became a worker for the state, where she went to go and inspect homes for the elderly all over California. I mean, it was a big deal job, but serving people was what she wanted to do. She was a nurse. She became a nurse to do. That's how she met Jim Jones. She was a nurse. He was an orderly. And then as the church got bigger and bigger, and so they called him, father or dad, called him dad. And so she was Mother Marceline.
Right. The familial language comes right in on all of these groups too. Yeah.
And they also adopted about 6 kids of different races and ethnicities, in addition to having one natural child. And
wow.
I think she really liked being Mother Marceline. And as happens in lots of families too, in nuclear families, you get the good parent and bad parent. And she got to be the good one. She was like the saint. People looked at her as she was saintly, and she put up with him. And all the congregation knew about his philandering. And so she was the saint to put up with it.
Wow.
And then also sorry.
Please carry on. I'm sorry. I interrupted you.
No, that's okay. I mean, so all these women, and I have, their presences in my book, although none of them are main characters, but they look at her and see themselves in her, right? It was something like nearly 2/3 female, his congregation too. Wow. And so here's this woman who works her butt off. Her husband treats her like shit, and she keeps going. She's a hard worker. And, what's important to her is like helping her children, helping the extended family. So I think that made her really, really sympathetic to so many of all those people, especially the women in the flock who were the majority.
Right.
So I think she got personal satisfaction that wasn't linked to him. And so I think there were goods for her. And I just want to throw this in here while I can, which was that the People's Temple, I think, was not a cult in the United States. When they moved to Guyana, it became a cult.
Understood. Yeah. Well, we can definitely talk more about that. And I'm very, very interested in your research and ideas about that. I'm very curious, because you deep dived on her. These cult leaders like L. Ron Hubbard, who I will, of course, immediately associate with, had a Mary Sue Hubbard, a wife, an enabler, a person who was also very into her family, very into her children. Hubbard and her, I think, had 5 children. I think Hubbard had a total of 7 or 8 children altogether between the 3 women he married. And she was his final wife. His first 2, there was a period of 1 year where he was married to both of them at the same time. Hubbard was as serial philanderer as you get. And there's even since we're on this topic, I'll bring this up. Have you seen a movie called The Master?
Yes.
You may recall a scene where she is talking with him, and this is all Paul Thomas Anderson similarly inferring and writing script for people who were based on real people but are clearly fictionalized. And this is Mary Sue and L. Ron Hubbard. And she makes it clear to him that she knows and is aware of his philandering and is aware of the problems that that's going to create, as long as it doesn't become publicly humiliating for her, as long as he can keep it, she will continue to empower and enable him and work with him, because she cares so much about the movement and the service and helping people and this kind of thing, and especially her family. I believe that there are a lot of similarities between the real life Mary Sue Hubbard and what you've described in Jones's wife. I guess I'm curious. So curious. How much did you have to infer, and how much do you know for sure this is who she was?
Yeah, I don't know A lot. I mean, she's in some of the tapes, and then there's also video. So I've seen her like move around.
Mm-hmm.
They had a band, the People's Temple Choir, and they put out more than one record, but this one that like became popular called He's Able. And she also sang, and there's recordings of her singing. And so I would say some of those things allowed me to get a glimpse into her, hearing her talk or hearing her sing or looking at her amongst other people in photographs or videos. But I did a lot of creating with her. And, all I can say is I would like to think that I captured something of her. And she's one of four protagonists, as I mentioned. But I've discovered from readers that everybody thinks it's a book about Marceline Jones.
Oh,
She kind of looms. I don't know. I never sort of counted pages to see. Does she have a lot more pages than the other three? But I don't think so. I think it was fairly even. But I've had a lot of older women readers who totally related to her, and her, at the end, her feeling, she doesn't want to be passive, but she can't help but be passive. She's been trained all her life to be passive in front of this guy, in front of men in general. And it's horrible, but she can't do anything. And she hates herself for it, So I think that figure of a woman from a certain period in American history who has ideals, but is not going to be the woman who's going to start her own church to follow her ideal. She's going to follow her husband in the ideal. So I think I hit a nerve somehow with readers. So, but that doesn't answer your question about like how accurate was it? I don't know. I mean, there are still some of the Jones children who are alive, both the natural and the adopted, and I haven't heard from them. So I don't know if they've read the book or they're aware of the book, and like that would be really interesting if one of them were to say, "Boy, you really got my mom down," without knowing her.
Well, that would be that really would be. That was my next question. So thanks for saying that I was curious if any of the Jones family had commented about this or you'd been in touch with them. And again, this is historical fiction, so it's not, there's no like criticism implied or at all in any of my questions. I'm literally just curious about, how you did this process.
I'm fine. I could take it anyway.
But no, it's all good. I just find it, I just want to be clear where I'm coming from on this, because I personally am very impressed with the effort. Very few people make this much effort and certainly spend years in the process of doing it, and then years more in the process of publishing it. So this has clearly been something you've worked very hard at, and I admire the effort.
Thank you.
Jones being the way that he was, the serial philanderer, this sort of like, doing it in front of everybody, even like everybody knows this is the case. And yet he's still able to pull off being the spiritual leader of this congregation, and people look to him for moral guidance, for life advice, for this is how I should conduct myself. It's a very interesting statement of culture and time and location and lots of things there. Do you think, how much of a, how do I phrase this? There's a cult leader playbook. There are certain things you have to do in order to take charge of a group of people and then abuse them and run them in a codependent way, the way cult leaders do. And there's all these sort of apparatus and organizational things that fall into place, either premeditatively or because they have to, right? You have to have a spy apparatus. You have to have a confession. Right. You have to have a reporting system. These things just fall into place, right?
Right.
Whether you're studying Goebbels or not, or whether you're looking to the Third Reich or not, or whether you're, studying Jim Jones at this point or not, if you're going to run a cult, you have to do these things. How apparent were any of the roots of that early on back in Indiana? Did you see any of that? Any red flags?
That's a very good question. And, you know, as with anything that's going to have a long life and which is going to metamorphose over time,
Yep.
you know, I don't see the worst of him appearing in Indiana. It doesn't, he doesn't, I mean, and what I know of the philandering was that wasn't in Indiana either. It didn't start until California.
Oh, okay. Okay, thanks for clarifying that.
And I may be wrong about that.
Fair
but,
enough.
He was, you know, he was still at the beginning of his trajectory in Indiana. And even though he had some momentum, it still wasn't like he was the big cheese. You know, he was just one of many white, charismatic Christian type preachers. And what made him different was his integrated following, right? And that was important to him. He went to Philadelphia to go study Father Divine, who was a Black preacher who had also started a colony, but there was no mass suicide, which is probably why you don't know Father Divine. But so he had an integrated following, and he did good works for the people, and so Jones went there to study him and copy him, and you know, he was good at doing that, at trying to find the best people to imitate, you know. So so you could say that could be malevolent. I don't know if it was malevolent at that time, like it became, but
Right.
like later in San Francisco, before they built their temple in San Francisco, he went to all these Black churches with all the big Black followings to study those preachers and copy their best, you know, characteristics so that he could steal more Black followers.
Interesting.
You know, that's malevolent, I think. You know, I mean, he became hated by a lot of those Black preachers in San Francisco for, you know, congregation stealing. It's a thing, you know, I didn't know.
That makes sense to me. That makes complete sense to me. I mean, you're not, you know, if you're going to build up a following, you need the people, and where are the people going to come from? Oh, hey, look at all these groups that already exist. Way easier to pilfer them than go generate new converts.
Exactly.
Absolutely true. And he was known, it seems, through his life, through his childhood, as like this ardent, like earnest believer. This, you know, but somebody who wanted to always be doing the best possible job at the job, I guess, right? Like I said, when you look at him as a child, right, practicing, you know, playing with this, I mean, there was clearly something there. And I'm wondering, from your research in this and your insight into this, what do you think that something was? Because there's a very fine line between a narcissist who is amassing power so that they can vampirically sort of suck it from people and be, you know, the God figure, versus the person who needs followers because they're generating energy and resources and power to get something done. You know, the individual in this world is powerless without the group behind them. And the more people that they can get, the more power they generate and the more resources they can get. This is the anatomy of getting things done in this world. So I'm wondering, was there a point where it looked like, or it felt like it was a sincere effort in that direction and then it went bad? Or was it kind of, no, this guy was just kind of all about himself from the very beginning?
Well, I think it's nuanced, you know. I mean, I really believe that the beginnings of the People's Temple were altruistic in the best sense of that word. And that's why he had like his followers in Indiana were black and white, working class and poor people. This was not the rich white intellectuals who came in later in California.
Okay.
But so those people, I think they saw what was genuine in him, and that's why approximately 100 families followed him to Northern California from Indiana.
That's a lot.
Because they were going to start this new life,
Right.
and in a better place, because for those of you who don't know, the Indiana was the headquarters of the Ku Klux Klan. It wasn't in the South, it was the Midwest.
Yeah. That is an important piece of information in this picture.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, I believe it was sincere, and I think Marceline was always sincere. I mean, I don't want to make her into some sort of virtuous beyond reality woman, but I think she wanted to do good things in the world, but she didn't have this massive ego like he does or did.
Right.
And so she didn't let ego gratification get in the way of doing good works like he did. And so I feel like at some point in California, as their congregation grew, and then he got this other group of people to follow him, the white intellectuals, college students, college professors, people with money and property that they could give over to People's Temple, because the people in Indiana didn't have that, And so then he started, getting, what's that expression? He's like getting seduced by his own bullshit.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Right. He started falling for his own con.
Right. And then you get to that point where people give over their power to him.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why absolute power corrupts absolutely, is because everybody's saying, yeah, you're the best, you're everything. And even if they know that can't be true, he's only another human being. So then he believes this hype. That's what I'm looking for.
There you go.
And then when the drug abuse starts kicking in, then I think he's a goner.
Right. I was going to ask you about that. But there are certainly some points to be made a little earlier before the drugs that I think are sort of important milestones on the path. These guys will tend to, and not to overgeneralize, because there are lots of paths to power and lots of paths to starting or making yourself into a cult leader. It's almost always, though, I've noted, more opportunism than it is planning, especially at the early days, where things just come together, and they come together in a way that, as you just so wonderfully described, the ego of the leader is being pumped up to such a level by the people around them. And this is where I'm going to just keep stressing that codependency. It's not a matter of anyone is at fault here. This is a really important point. It's not a matter of, well, it was on them, they deserved what they got. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that there is a sequence of events where people, as you just so wonderfully put, give over their power. And the cult leader is the kind of person who's going to take it. And they're going to run with it.
Gladly. Yes.
And when money and land and resources, as I was talking about, so apparently California was a bit of the promised land for them. And he was making promises, but initially it appears he was delivering on them. Would that be accurate?
No. I mean, yes, you're accurate in that the social justice part of what they were doing, which when they moved they had a temple in San Francisco and in LA, and they were having programs to get people off of drugs, which is ironic, right? Because he's becoming a drug addict.
That's
But,
right.
Really serious addicts could get clean from the temple, from their time with, and it wasn't Jim Jones, right? There's all these people working there who make things happen. It's not like just him.
Right.
And so that's one of my other characters, who's an African-American man from Watts, who ends up, his grandma makes him come with her, and she's like one of the old ladies who's a believer, and he doesn't believe in anything, but she sort of makes him come, and then he joins the drug program to get clean, and he gets clean, and he makes some friends, other guys like him and women who get clean, and then he ends up sticking with them because it's sort of easier to do than leaving. And I think for all of the idealistic white college types, like seeing that happen was, look, we are having a difference.
Yep.
They would help people get off of drugs. They would help old people get their Social Security business together, like help them with the paperwork, take them to the doctor, take them to the dentist. And, they were doing things that seemed tangibly to make the world a better place.
Exactly. And that's undeniable. It's actually a historical reality that happened. And a lot of people who were part of that group did a lot of good, which is why it grew. And in growing, when did, from what you were able to discern, what time period are we talking about now with this period of growth in San Francisco and the anti-drug stuff? When was that happening?
So that was kind of from 72 to 77. 77 was when they went en masse to Guyana, 77. Okay. And 78 was the massacre.
Right.
So they really only down there about a year plus.
Right.
And when they were in San Francisco and doing these, they not only did services there, but they had this fleet of Greyhound buses where they would travel across the country and do these massive meetings, to bring more people in. And so that did bring more people. More people came back to California with them. And so by that time, though, he was already drugged out. He had his own little room in in the back of one of the Greyhounds where he would try and do his seducing. I mean, there are all these other people on the bus. I mean, you could close the door, but still, it's awfully brazen.
Right.
So, so he's going downhill already, but he's kind of like being a high functioning drunk, where he can get lots of stuff done, even though he's on he started taking speed because he wanted to do more things and he felt like sleep was a waste of time,
That's how it started. I was going to ask, is that how it started?
Beginning.
Right. There it is.
But he goes on to do more than just speed. But right. Yeah, so the period of rot, I feel like, was already setting in the early 70s. Okay. So if you wanted to see it, you could see it. But if you didn't want to look at that part, you could not look at that part.
That's right. That's typical human behavior, right? He's my Lord and Savior. Right. He can do no wrong. So I guess we're targeting. So did it go back to? Well, I guess we've already established in terms of it started with the speed, and then it just kind of went out of control from there. And I think anybody who's ever touched drugs or has been known somebody who has is going to understand exactly how that cycle occurs. And it is absolutely a dwindling spiral, so to speak. So we know how that happened to him. And yet at the same time, not only is he building up a congregation, this is not just some hippie commune or interracial, gathering. He's also at this time, if I understand things right, making inroads, real progress in speaking with bureaucrats, legislators, government officials, city leaders, civic leaders. Like, he's actually out there doing some work. Is that right?
I mean, he's into the politics which offer power and recognition, right? That's his, like, unlike a lot of other cult leaders, he's not driven by having lots of money and having expensive things and cars and Rolls Royces.
Right.
I mean, he didn't. I mean, he did some things that made him different from his congregation in that, like, he would take vacations, like, and so he was this total workaholic, but so he and his family sometimes to go away for a weekend or something. But mostly it was the power and this idea of doing good that was driving him. So he was head of the housing commission in San Francisco, and they did this political action where one of these, what do they call it, like short use hotels was going to be torn down to build something. And I think it was to build a luxury hotel. And so they did this big protest on the street that got a lot of attention, like, where are all these poor people who live in these hotels? Where are they going to go? I mean, that's still happening today, right? So,
right.
Yeah, and actually back in Indiana, he had one political position as well. So, so the seeds of getting a larger sphere of influence beyond the church, that was already implanted back in Indiana.
Right. And it makes sense because if you are a person of conviction and social justice, for example, with him, and this is going to be one of these things where it's going to, like, it could be misinterpreted as I'm somehow saying this as an apologist for him, and please believe me, I am not. I'm trying to comment on the psychology of this. This is where I come from. And here you have a man who is probably convinced himself that everything this guy touches can turn to gold, and he could be a savior figure. He could be a real difference in this world.
Right.
A force for good. And there is no one who, in the early days, there's no one who can amass power or get things done in this world without pissing some people off. The fact you have enemies is not a sign that you're a bad person. The fact that you've pissed people off is not a sign you're a bad person, right? If you're getting things done and you're a man on a mission, that's what you're doing. And I'm wondering, from a psychological point of view, I guess, and I'm wondering what your insight is on this. From Indiana to San Francisco to the drugs, I think we see a path of somebody who is losing control, but I don't know that he's aware he's losing control. What do you think?
Correct. Yeah. I mean, no, I think that's right. And he's surrounded by enablers, including his wife, who keep giving him drugs. Like somebody, and especially his wife, he said, Jim, you have to dry up now. We got to take away a month and you got to get clean. And that never happened, never once.
Right.
And, I think he felt like he was superior to other drug addicts. He could control his problem and he didn't need any intervention. So it was this sense that, a kind of godly or superhuman sense that he could do more and more and more. And I agree with you that he is not self-aware enough to understand that he's losing his grip.
Right. Right.
And nobody's telling him that either.
Exactly. And that's a really important point, right? Because that is part of the package of this, is that the cult leaders get an inner circle, an entourage,
Yes.
a group of
Yes.
yes men, sycophants, flying monkeys is the latest term for this.
Okay.
Right? But it's still the mass of people who are not about to restrain or rein in that guy. Right? They're just not. They don't want to. They don't see the need to.
Yeah. And so the people who leave, and there was a famous defection called the Group of Eight in 1973, 4 men and 4 women, 4 black and 4 white. And they had, as part of the help that the temple offered, they had gone off to Santa Rosa Junior College to take classes. And guess what? You start getting an education and you start getting some realization. And also, then they're away from the temple. They're not living with other temple people. And so these 8 young people, they decided to leave. And they wrote him a letter. And it wasn't like, we hate you. It was like, no, we love you, but, and trying to like keep it open for dialogue. But, and this is another total common cult thing, is if they're gone, they're traitors. They are persona non grata. And most of these people had all these family members who were still in the temple, and the communication was forbidden.
Yeah, there it is.
Them.
Yeah.
And so the people who kind of recognized what was going on, they got away.
Right.
And so there weren't people who were left to criticize them, although, there was always some element of criticism. And very sadly, down in Guyana, he would drug those people.
Right. There we go.
So they had the largest deposit of thorazine in South America.
Wow. We'll definitely get to that. I wanted to explore this middle region a little bit more.
Yeah.
And we'll get to that because these are powerful pieces of information and very, very informative. Because they show you, again, these milestones along the path. And as early as 73, they're disconnecting or disfellowshipping or whatever word they used for it.
Right.
But, and again, these are milestones every one of these groups has. There's always a significant point where a group of people who you would not have suspected would do it publicly depart. And it creates a rift where maybe by 73, this was already in place, or it was a response to these 8. I don't know. In 1960 is when such a thing happened to L. Ron Hubbard, where his own son and about 7 or 8 people just said, yeah, we're done. We're out of here. You're not paying us. You're not, giving us any attention. And we're kind of sick of it. And that was a real turning point in Scientology's history. Because his own son publicly departing, Hubbard was fit to be tied, right? And from that came a number of authoritarian decisions that really made Scientology into what it is now.
Yeah.
So with Jones, was there, I'm just out of sheer curiosity, before this group of 8, was there any indication that they were doing that kind of disconnection thing?
I don't have all the dates exactly in my head, but there was a couple who had been these mega gung-ho supporters of Jones, and then they left. And so I can't remember if this is before 73 or after 73. Sure. But anyway, so this couple left and changed their names because, but he was already like, you better watch your step, man. If you leave here, you better watch your back. And
wow.
And anyway, this couple, they got murdered in their home. And it was never proven, was it just an East Bay burglary gone awry, or did Jones really send his henchmen out there and they killed him successfully without getting caught? We don't know. I don't
Right.
think their murderers were ever caught.
Wow. Wow. And you can't help but wonder, in hindsight, it's a very real possibility. I mean, murder's not off the table once a certain line is crossed.
Right.
It's
And
just
there was
not.
another guy in San Francisco who was being a critic, and he died in a work accident. So it was you can have work accidents. They really happen, but
Yeah.
he was an outspoken critic and he got silenced by this work accident.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Kind of like, Putin's enemies just kind of keep taking plunges out the windows, they just
Right.
one
Or
for one for
somehow their
one.
tea gets poisoned.
Yeah, it's just so weird. It's such a coincidence around these types of people. Boy, and that's of course a line you can't uncross. Once you've gone all that way, you are all in, and Jones certainly was all in. So interesting that it could have at least developed, and we see strong cult manifestations as much as 5-6 years before the tragedy. This indicates to me a years-long campaign that Jones must have been running on his followers as he slipped more and more out of reality and more into his drug-induced reality, that he took them along for a ride into further and further places away from reality. I'm imagining that is what happened. Can you tell me what happened? Did that happen? And what sort of things did you see that would have shown that?
Well, if you stop and think about one man as a leader and 917 people dying on one day, did Jones kill all of them?
Right.
No. Did he kill any of them? Like personally? No.
Nope.
So he had a whole slew of inner circle who were mostly white women, but not exclusively, who made everything happen.
White women, really?
Yeah.
Huh. I find that interesting.
He had lots of sexual dalliances with many of the women in the inner circle. And some men. Okay, he was also bisexual, even though he sort of railed against homosexuality. He himself had been with men, and
hardly a surprise. That level of hypocrisy is typical for these kind of people.
Yeah. So, somewhere again, by the time they get to Guyana, he's got people who are, they've already, let's say, swallowed the Kool-Aid.
Right.
There are documents written up by some of these women about what are they going to do if the worst comes to the worst. Like, you got to plan a mass poisoning. You got to get the poison. You got to get it shipped to this remote location.
Mm-hmm.
And the guy who masterminds the poison is the doctor, right?
And what was his name?
His name was Larry Schacht.
Okay.
And he had come to the temple as one of the drug addicts, and he got clean, and then Jones helped him go to med school in Mexico. And when I say helped him, I mean financially, but also he got a contact to step in to help him get into this med school. And the deal was that he would come back and be a doctor for the People's Temple. And that's what he did. And he was apparently a pretty good doctor. But he's the one who researched the poison, got the poison. He also did a very bad job of it because there wasn't enough Valium in it. So everybody was suffering and screaming, and it wasn't supposed to be like that.
Oh, man.
But anyway, so there were tons of these enablers, many of them people with educations who who decided to go along with the, with delusional irreality that Jones was living in, even though I don't think other people were drug addicts. I think he was the drug addict there.
Right. I understood it to be that the setup of going down to the impetus for going down to Guyana in the first place, Jones's paranoia that drove that, was the idea that the government was now going to be coming after them, or that he was now a target of investigation. And he first had to get out of California. And so, off they go. And hey, surprise, that kind of fly-by-night operation is typical for cult leaders, right? They go from place to place to place as soon as the law is catching up with them. But Jones was actually an agent of social change, was working with these people, was working with law enforcement, and then it just went so south over a period of years where he became the target. And then he went, okay, we got to go down to Jonestown, or we got to go somewhere else outside the United States, and that's the place they chose. And then the idea was, and please correct me if I'm wrong, the idea was that this was a final solution if they showed up down there to come get him, that it would be better for everybody to be dead than to be captured by the man or something. It was that kind of a thing.
No, that is correct.
Okay.
And before they fled, he was under investigation because he was doing financial shenanigans. And it wasn't like, oh, they're going to persecute me. It was like he was doing criminal things with the books, and people were on to him. And so this magazine was going to publish an investigative report into People's Temple. And he got his henchmen to go to the magazine office to grab the story out of the files, right? This is before everything was on computers.
Right.
And so that was his first act of intimidation. But guess what? They had another copy. And so they were going to run it, and his intimidation didn't work. And that's when he decided, we just have to flee now. He could have said, I'm not doing anything wrong. I'm going to stay and fight, right?
Yep.
But no, he was doing something wrong. So it wasn't, sometimes when you're paranoid, people really are following you. And, his time of getting away with everything was coming to an end, and he saw it.
Yes.
And he said, we got to get at it. We got to get out of the States because they'll come after me.
That's right. That's right. Hubbard was exactly the same way. That's why they went to the sea. That's why he fled to England. That's why they went to the ocean. That's why he spent years out there. Same mental headspace, right? Which is why I find the parallels so interesting. Always trying to stay ahead. And it's interesting though that Jones didn't try to lawyer up, try to build a shield wall of money to protect himself. Instead, he was like, no, we got to get out of here. Do you know why he thought that? Why he didn't try to stay and fight? Any ideas?
Well, so back in 1973, that's when they bought the land in Guyana. They bought...
Oh, they had it that long back.
800 acres and it was pure jungle.
Yep.
And the idea was they were going to build this, was called the People's Temple Agricultural Project. And so it was a very American idea of utopia. We're going to go out in the wilderness. We're going to start a farm. We're going to support ourselves. It was kind of a beautiful utopian dream. And so that had already started as an idea. And then there were 25 people down there who were bulldozing the jungle, building houses. I mean, it's an incredible thing that they did, was to build Jonestown out of the jungle. There was nothing there. And they built that, in a fairly short amount of time. So that was percolating. I don't know if he saw that, oh, that's going to be my refuge when they come get me, or this is another project we have.
Right.
Other country. So when then he fled, but then when they were in Jonestown, that's when he had to lawyer up because, among other things, a couple who had a child who was apparently actually Jim Jones's son, but they'd left him, the child, with the People's Temple, and they wanted to get him out. And so they were, and one of them, the man, was his big lawyer who finally turned against him. And so, like, at the very end, a bunch of people defected. And so he was one of them, and they were now the devil incarnate. And so the couple was trying to get their kid out of the jungle, and they hired these lawyers, and they had to serve him papers out in the jungle, which was like a 24-hour trip by boat from Guyana, from Georgetown, the capital. And that was another way in which he got all these people to feel sympathetic toward him. Look, they're persecuting me. They want to take my child away.
Right.
I'm not going to let them take my child away, even though, like, the mother should have gotten her child at least. And so there was a legal process that got put into place in the court in Georgetown, where he was supposed to show up, and what is it called? Custody rights. That's what that was about. And he was very successful, kind of like another giant cult leader we know today, who is really successful at stalling the court.
Yes. That is where the money and power really comes into play, is stalling the systems of control that we have to regulate all of this, because we have systems of control and power and law to stop this sort of thing. But man, do those wheels turn slow, especially when you have the money and resources to and connections to be able to shut it down.
Right.
And in another country, American dollars in the 1970s, I imagine it was he was quite good at stalling that stuff. But he was also losing his damn mind so quickly that it was heading towards this disaster that nobody really saw coming. Or did nobody see it coming? Were there any indications that it was coming?
Well, yes, because the so-called White Night ceremony, which was everybody taking a drink and not knowing if it was poison or not. So these were practice mass suicide nights. And he did a number of them in the jungle that weren't poison after all. So nobody died. But it was like, this is the big loyalty test. And there was on a smaller level with the inner circle, he did one back in California as well. So this vision of, I'm going to take everybody with me when it's time to go, that had been around for a long time.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense.
He also co-opted the Black Panthers' phrase of revolutionary suicide, which when Huey Newton or whichever Black Panther came up with that phrase, that was about fighting until you were dead. It wasn't about, let's take poison and lie down, know, but of course he corrupted it. And he said, we're not committing suicide. This is revolutionary suicide, and we're going down for our, dreams and desires against the man, etc. So yeah, it was coming. And one of the high-level defectors, the woman who wrote the book called Seductive Poison, so she got out right before the end, and she went to the embassy and she said, this is coming. And then she got back to the States and she went to Congress and said, this is coming. And guess what? Nobody believed her.
You don't say. So what was the series of events between that and getting Senator Paul Ryan down there?
Congressman, yeah.
Congressman, yeah. Well, what happened to finally get some attention? Because that seemed to be, from what I understand, the spark that actually activated the tragedy.
Yes, that was the catalyst.
Yes.
So there were all these people back in California who were worried about their people in Jonestown. And, you know, the mail that came out of Jonestown had been censored. Everybody was having the time of their lives, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
And so there were people who had family members there who went to the congressman to say, you know, help us. These are American citizens, and we don't even know if they're okay. So, and then here's an interesting little tie back. One of those defectors in the group of 8, he ended up being one of the people who went to the congressman. It was called the Group of Concerned Relatives, with capital C, capital R. And so they were the force behind lobbying Congressman Ryan to go and check up on their families.
Okay.
And so they were successful in convincing him to go. And he was the guy who kind of liked drama and liked being in the public eye. Like, he had gone underground at San Quentin to see what conditions were like in San Quentin. So he wasn't your average congressman.
Okay. So he was an activist. He was a hardcore guy. And he was also a sitting congressman. So he probably felt like safe. You know?
Right. And he was the first congressman to get killed in the line of duty.
Yeah.
So
yeah. Jones had him.
He was safe until then. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Because he went down there and checked things out, and it was pretty ugly. And then somebody slipped him a note, and there were just a series of events that just triggered Jones, and he had those guys killed on the way out at the airfield just as they were trying to leave, and then initiated, you know, Project Termination or whatever they called it, and it went from there. So when we look at events like this, there's always massive amounts of hindsight bias laid over it. Could have seen this, should have seen this. This was so obvious that it was going to happen, right? But up until it happens, up until tragedies like this occur, mass shootings occur, other civil unrest occurs, it's not obvious. It's never obvious. If it was obvious, people would stop it before it happened. Have you seen or noticed in your research of this and writing this book and talking with people about this, have you seen changes made to our systems or to the media or how this is approached in any way that would indicate that something like this couldn't happen again? I almost feel silly for asking the question, but I want to ask.
Well, it's interesting that you ask this right now, because I've only just now learned that in France, they have a department in the government that's supposed to keep close watch on these sort of alternative religious groups, precisely to stop something like this. Because, you know, in France and Switzerland, there was the Solar Temple that was a cult that did a mass suicide on a much smaller scale.
That's right.
So they know about this kind of thing over there. And so they, as European governments are more likely to do, said, let's get the government involved and see if this can be stopped. So that exists today in the French government. But then you have all of the people who are like, stop policing religion. You know, and in our country, it's even worse like that, where First Amendment, I can say whatever I want. Second Amendment, I can shoot whoever I want.
That's right.
You know, kind of like that. So so there's one country that's put something in place. I don't know, maybe it's prevented some mass suicides in the years it's been in existence. I haven't heard about any mass suicides in France in the last while. Of course, there was just enormous one last year in Kenya which you probably heard about.
Yep, I do.
And
That's
just
right.
like yesterday, they found some more bodies. They're
That's
up to
right.
like 600 or something.
That's
But
right.
anyway, in our country, I feel like it's much worse in the opposite direction, where everybody's like, hands off my religion, hands off my homeschooling, because that's a lot of abuse happens with the homeschooling situations.
Yep.
So, no, I'm not going to answer your question in the affirmative that anything has been put into place to stop something like this from happening. And of
Right.
course, that was 78, and you had Waco, in the 90s, where, the government did all these stupid things that started the fire, but then those people are like, yeah, we're going to die. We want to die for our cause, and don't leave. You can't leave.
That's right.
So,
That's exactly right. No, it seems to me, of course, that the safeguards for this are almost completely non-existent. And I'm glad you said that about the United States, because it's absolutely true. France, at least, has a more narrow view of sects, as they call it, sects, rather than cults is the term they use. But they are very serious about it, and they do engage in government oversight, and they should.
Yeah.
That's my position on it. And and there are a great many people who see government overreach and authoritarianism and even big brotherism in that. Because we have this tradition of the very founding of our country being escaping religious persecution. And religious persecution is a thing. And it's got its own level of history and horror stories that are atrocious and awful and Inquisition-like and all kinds of things, ironically Inquisition-like. So there's so much awful there that people go, well, we don't want that. So let's pendulum swing this other way and let people just believe what they want, say what they want, do what they want. And the cost of that, I suppose, is going to be from time to time, we're going to have these atrocities committed by psychopaths. And I guess that's just the price of freedom of religion. And I disagree. I disagree very strongly with that attitude. Unfortunately, since Jonestown, I was curious, have you run into, because I certainly have, run into a number of academics whose immediate response in the 70s and response from that time forward has been, well, freedom of religion is more important. And so therefore, we're going to write papers and we're going to do expert witness testimony, and we're going to assert very strongly that if you have any critical thoughts or statements about new religious movements, and Jonestown and the People's Temple would absolutely have fit into that category.
Yeah.
You're the problem. You're the problem, see, because you're trying to stop people from practicing their religion. Knowing everything you now know about all of this, what would your response be to such individuals? Because I don't think it's a black and white thing. I think it's a nuanced problem.
No, it isn't. Yeah.
What's your take on it?
Yeah. Well, I think freedom of religion is great as a principle, as an abstraction. I think when children are involved, and we assume children don't have their own agency, I think in that case, the government should be involved. Like that one in New Zealand with all those kids, I'm forgetting the name of it, but you have these children growing up under these conditions that are sort of like slavery or something, and it's all in the name of freedom of religion.
Yep.
So okay, if you say, all right, adults can theoretically make up their own minds, that's fine. But once you get, and most of these crazy cults, they're really into reproducing and bringing up children in these. And then when there's sexual abuse, it's a nightmare. So I'm more of a law and order type in this sense of policing people, because I think people will do wrong when left to their own devices.
I have to agree. I wish we have this very liberal, very progressive, but of course, there's an opposite view of it on the right as well. This stoic independence, this independent attitude, this thriving and surviving of the ego and the individual, and the glorification of that. And I get it. But if you don't put some controls in on people and they get together in these groups, things can get out of hand, and they get out of hand real fast.
The one I was thinking is called Gloria Vale in New Zealand.
Mm-hmm.
And, there's this massive group of people, and they're living on the island. It's not like they're on some separate island. I mean, they're there. And they're raising tons of children, right? Because all the women are always supposed to reproduce in ridiculous numbers. And, I think that's wrong. I think it's a dereliction of duty on the part of the government.
I do too.
Just do whatever you want with these kids.
That's right. That I could not agree more. Children are little sponges. They are not responsible for what happens to them, and all too often. And I wish it wasn't this way. I got to really be clear. This isn't because I want things to be this way. It just is this way. Children are often victimized by narcissistic, predatory people who lead up these groups, not just the charismatic leader, but the inner circle, the entourage that develops around them. And they abuse their power, and they abuse it 100% of the time. There are not examples of this where they don't do that. Mm-hmm. They always go there. And so, whether it's sanctioned by the government or the local officials or whatever, or it's some off the reservation thing, or it's, all throughout the United States, we can point to the troubled teen industry. I mean, this permeates all levels of our society. Yeah. And it's often off the grid. It's hidden stuff. There are farms right here in Colorado and encampments up in the mountains where people are doing things that are just really grossly not okay. And they're doing it to children. And this is all unregulated, right? It's a massive problem. People really have no idea until you get into this world and really start digging into it. You just don't realize the scope of the problem.
Yes.
So I hope, I guess, where I'm kind of going with all this doom and gloom is I hope that a book like yours, where do people get it?
Okay, well, there's an electronic version and a paperback version. And I have discovered that it is available everywhere, all over the world, online. You can order from bookstores or online places where you pay some money and download the book. And so Excellent. You can really go to your favorite location for it. The only thing I'll say is that if you order it from Amazon or Barnes & Noble, then you can write a review of it on their website. And my publisher says that reader reviews are really important. So that's a plus for Amazon. But if you don't want to spend your money on Amazon, don't. There's a website called bookfinder.com where you can look up any book and it'll tell you every place in the world where it's available and the prices. So you can go to the cheapest one there. And I mean, that's what I do with a lot of book searches that I do.
Wow, I didn't know about that. I'm now going to use that. That's great.
It's great. It's
bookfinder.com.
Really
all right, cool.
Yeah.
Okay, good. I just wanted to get that out of the way because I wanted people to know where to go find this book, because I hope it makes a difference. This is the public awareness campaign that basically us ex-cult members are involved in. When you look across YouTube or social media or documentaries and Netflix and things like that, you see an awful lot of content being generated about this subject, and it's being generated mostly by the victims of people who have, been taken advantage of in an effort to try to raise awareness of this. And as a result of this, we've now got a subgenre of true crime. We've now got more awareness than we've ever had before about narcissists and cult leaders, and we can talk about this in more public settings, and people go, oh yeah, I heard about that, I know about that, I saw a documentary or whatever, I saw some shows about that, and that is a very, very different place from where we were in the 70s. I'm curious, as a final question to you here as we wrap up today, do you think it's a different situation now? Do you think it's different at the consumer level in any way based on all the work that has been being done?
I think that cult awareness is a real thing right now, and that you couldn't have said that a decade ago.
Yep.
And probably the biggest factor in that have been these Netflix documentaries who reach so many people everywhere across the world, and all different classes of human beings in terms of educated, uneducated, readers, non-readers. So I'm grateful for that. I think that has been, if they're done well, sometimes they're not, and they're very shoddy and superficial, but that's like anything else. So I do think the awareness part has improved. That's a real positive. I think that sadly the internet has given rise to a different genre of cult building that didn't exist before the internet. And in some ways, it's much more insidious than getting a bunch of people in the jungle isolated from the rest of the world when you can reach everybody in their home over their computer.
That's right.
So that's a negative. I don't know if it cancels out the positive. But I mean, for my purposes, one reader said to me, I'm so glad you're finally shining some light on the victims instead of the perpetrator. And I hadn't thought about it in that language before, but it's like, duh, like, don't we care about the victims? But in all the Jim Jones coverage, it's always it's love-hate, it's like, we got to pay attention to him because he's so fascinating. And I get that, right? We all like to look at the car accident on the highway. We can't pull our eyes away. But I would like to think in a better world, we pay more attention to the victims. So that's what I'm trying to do.
Perfect. Well, it's along the exact same line that this has been built. It has been the victims speaking out, getting a voice on the internet, which has really been the thing that has leveled the playing field for us. Because up until 2004 or 5, if you didn't get a spot on CNN or get a media reporter to pay attention to you, or go write your own book and find a publisher to publish it, you were never getting your story out.
Right.
And now the proliferation of stories is never been greater. So it really has been a double-edged sword in so many ways. You are not wrong about online cults. It's a whole new model. And QAnon and Trumpism and other populist movements have very, very much gravitated in that direction, as well as a host of low-tier level players, your Teal Swans of the world, and these people who generate, build up these followings online. So I think it's a human problem, and I think it's a cross-cultural problem. I don't think there's any place in the world where this doesn't happen, as we know, in Kenya, in Southeast Asia, in in Europe, in the United States. Any group of people can turn into this. So we always have to be on our guard. How do people find out about you and your work? Where should they go? Do you have a website or an email or anything like that?
I do have a website. It's anniedawid.com.
Great.
ANNIEDAWID. It's like David with a W. I'm not making a typo in my own name, which I've gotten for 64 years, right? So yeah, you can go to my website, and from there you can find my contact info. You can read reviews of the book. You can see where all the podcasts are and interviews and everything else. Beautiful. Oh, and I should say, since we're in Colorado, my book is a finalist for the Colorado Book Award in historical fiction, and I'll be finding out on June 21st at the award ceremony, which is not that far away. So
that's right.
crossing
Excellent.
my digits.
Good. Well, I have high hopes for you too. Excellent, folks out there. You can find a link to her channel or to her website down below in the description section to this video, and in the description section on Podbean for where the podcast here is hosted. So I hope you will check her out. Annie, I want to thank you very, very much today for taking the time to talk to me.
It's been a great conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Awesome. I did too. Thanks again. All right, folks out there, subscribe to the channel, of course, if you are not. Like, share, get it out there across the interwebs. That is always how you can help me grow my channel, my podcast here. And if you need, I will end with this, if you need any personal one-on-one with me in terms of consultation or advice or guidance or direction about a coercive situation you might be involved in, you don't know what to do, your family member's in a cult, you don't know what to do, contact me. I can help you out. We can work it out. I helped a lot of people with that. You can reach me through my website. And on that happy note, I will see you guys next week. Bye-bye.